welcome to this RSA webinar for this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Meredith Doig, President of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Now, wherever you're joining us from, the RSA does acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and sea and community. And tonight, as you now know, our very special guest speaker is Jack Galvin Waight. Jack works for an organisation that has 70,000 members. So what organisation is that, you might say? Well, it's the Teachers Union of New South Wales. He represents public school teachers in New South Wales, or the union represents public school teachers in New South Wales. Jack was originally a history and languages teacher, but for the past 10 years, he's been what's called a regional organiser, looking after schools and teachers and students in the Hunter region from Newcastle to Merriwa. And most relevantly for this evening's presentation, Jack is the Federation's representative on the New South Wales Education Department's Consultative Committee on SRE and SEE, that is Special Religious Education and Special Ethics Education. Jack's wife is a primary school teacher and they have 2 kids, both of whom go to public schools. Now, each year the Federation, the Teachers Federation, provides a grant for people to do research into areas that are relevant to the union and to the profession of teaching in general. Jack won one of these grants and he chose to look into the role of religion in public schools. The resulting report, which hopefully some of you have now seen, there's a link in the chat box to this report. It's called Teaching, Not Preaching, as you can see on the slide. Making our public schools secular. And it's a terrific read. I really encourage everybody to download that link in our chat box and have a read of it. Now, Jack will present through his slides for about 20 minutes. And then, as usual, we'll work through some questions that have been sent in beforehand during the registration. And then if we've got time, we'll also go through questions that you can write in the chat box. So Jack, I'm going to hand over to you shortly, but I have a question which I'm going to start off with, if you wouldn't mind, and that is, why in the title of your report, why have you said making our public schools secular? I thought they were supposed to be secular.
Thanks, Meredith, and thanks everyone, and apologies for the technical issues. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and I'm zooming today on Awabakal land. And great question to start with, Meredith. The original title was actually keeping our public schools secular, and it was only through the research and the damning evidence really that I realised that I kind of questioned if we'd ever had a secular public education system, but it certainly got a lot worse. So I did have to change that title to making our public schools secular. And look, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're part of this amazing and vibrant multicultural society with over 260 religions. A number of people have asked me, Meredith, why I've chosen to take on this controversial topic, and it's certainly not to make friends, but I think it is really important. And the big reason is our campaigns. I really wanted to analyse what effect record funding to religious schools, chaplains, SRE is having on our progressive campaigns. What effect is generation after generation of SRE having on our students and society? And most importantly, as a union and a community, what can we do to make sure that our schools remain free, compulsory, and most importantly, secular? I do want to start by highlighting, look, this report is not a critique of religion. Federation, we've got a real proud history of promoting inclusion and celebrating diversity Instead, the aim and rationale of this report is to answer this. I call it a religious paradox. Is why is it that never before there's been so much funding and religious influence, yet in complete contrast, census and survey data shows our community values are moving away from religious beliefs. So how are we in this situation? Why does the religious lobby hold so much influence, and how can we safeguard our secular system in this context? This is an action research project, which basically means that as part of the research process, I've continued to build alliances, develop strategies and campaign in this field. And what really surprised me is how under-researched this important topic is. And although academics and many of them that have been on this show before have looked at the how and the why, to my knowledge, this is the first project to actually put these things together and have a detailed strategy for change. Look, team, like in the early 19th century, as Australians, we did something really special. We put aside our sectarian division, came together and created the world's first legislated secular education system. And at that time, we abolished state aid to religious schools and cemented our public education system as one of the best in the world. Shortly afterwards, we enshrined Australia's secularity in Section 116 of our Constitution. And we did all this by embracing the secular. Unfortunately, my research revealed that many Australians no longer seem to understand the importance of this separation of church and state, and the word's been really purposely maligned to mean anti-religious, which it's not. It actually protects all religions, and it's our best chance for peace and prosperity. Moreover, when challenged by case law, the courts have taken a very narrow legal interpretation of Section 116, in particular the Defence of Government Schools case, which actually argued that funding to religious schools was unconstitutional, like in the United States. Unfortunately, in New South Wales as well, there was a big compromise, and to get the legislation through, Henry Parkes agreed to allow 1 hour a week scripture in our schools. So are we a secular nation? And in my interviews, I really asked this question, and Meredith, your answer actually in my interview really resonated with me, and it was socially, yes, absolutely. And you can see that with the religious freedom bills. Legally, it's arguable because of that narrow interpretation, but I'd say yes. But politically, no. There's simply too much religious influence in our political system, and this in education ties in with that ongoing cultural wars, and education policies just become so highly politicised that regrettably our classrooms have become one of the primary sites for conflict about the relationship between religion and state.
Jack, just before you go to this next slide, can you redirect the camera on your phone back to your face? That's it. Because we are recording this and we'd like to have some of your face rather than your wonderful ceiling.
Yeah. No, not many people ask for that, Meredith, but
thanks very much. Go ahead.
So in the 90s, experts were actually predicting the end of religion in public life, but then September 11, the subsequent war era, and in Australia, John Howard's strategy to woo the religious vote. The same experts are now describing the 21st century as the return to fundamentalist religion, and it's no coincidence that this has occurred the same time as the global shift towards right-wing governments, Trump, anti-abortion, anti-vaxxers, and everything else that's good about the world at the moment. And I think we need to see in this context that SRE and Scripture and the chaplaincy program is no longer what parents may remember as relatively harmless, but if it ever was actually that. So special religious education is Scripture. In Victoria, it's called SRI, and in different states it has different, but it's certainly special. There's no doubt about that. No other rules apply. It's this real black hole in the school week, and the legislation's hardly changed. 1880s, during which time teachers went to school on horse and cart, and as me 6-year-old said the other day, you were probably still in high school then, Dad. but the specialness of SRE is best summed up, I think, in the provider's own words, as you can see in the screen. They think, they can't believe their luck. It's an open door to the minds of our kids. And as Federation and this research paper says, and the other advocacy group says, look, it's high time we close that door now. So Federation and community members have been complaining about SRE for years, in particular the inappropriate content of the lessons.
Thanks, Jack. So, sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. You just missed my best dad jokes, I'm sure then.
Sorry.
What do parents think? Most parents are shocked when they find out what's occurring, often becoming the greatest campaigners for change. And the organisation FIRIS on the screen is a great example of this. This group of dedicated activists have been leading the campaign to remove SRE for many years. And as MP David Shoebridge said in the Teachers Not Preachers webinar, in many ways FIRIS has become the regulator, and it's certainly not the Department of Education who have outlined that it's bordering on maladministration. And if you do one thing from this webinar, I encourage you to check out FIRIS's website and Facebook page. If you're in other states, there's some great organisations doing great things. In Queensland, I encourage you to view the QPSS, Queensland Parents for Secular State Schools. They do fantastic work as well. So as part of this report for Federation, we commissioned an online survey of 1,500 adults across New South Wales, and the results showed that the most parents want religion to be taught after school hours, and that most supporters for secular values to be taught. And the grey on the graph here is the 15% is SRE. And interestingly, international comparisons show that Australia is completely out of step. So most developed countries have now recognised the dangers of segregated religious instruction. And the UN even describes our segregated model as a ghetto approach to religious education. What do principal groups think? As these survey results show, the majority of principals are scathing. Both scripture and ethics, they're logistical nightmares for school. And as part of this report, and for the first time in New South Wales, we have a real unified educational alliance that the scripture just has to go, at the very least, not occur during classroom teaching time. So should schools still teach general religious education? Absolutely. Previous debates have centred around that polarising question of, do we want religion and or ethics in schools? And of course our students should be taught about religion and ethics. The students have the right to be educated, not indoctrinated, and that distinction is significant. So strategically framing this complicated and controversial debate is the key, as outlined in my recommendations. As I'm sure you're aware, the chaplaincy program is one of our biggest secular breaches, and quite frankly just waste of money. I can't highlight enough how much SRE and the chaplaincy providers are interconnected. The idea even came about by a Victorian pastor and scripture teacher who told Greg Hunt, our former federal health minister, wouldn't it be great to have an evangelical missionary in every school in the area? And Greg Hunt loved the idea, and he pitched it to Howard. He said, no, this is too good an idea for just Victoria. Let's roll it out across the state. And so begins a sorry state of affairs. Until 2012, and the legendary Queensland father, Ron Williams, successfully took the federal government to the High Court.
And Ron's on the line with us.
Legend. Good to see you, Ron. So in an act of treachery, however, 5 days later, our Prime Minister at the time, Julia Gillard, rushed through emergency legislation that included paying Scripture Union Queensland more than $6.2 million. And academic Kathy Byrne outlines that of the around $50 per hour provided to the chaplaincy provider, the poor chaplain often only receives around $16. And in many of the cases, the rest of the money has gone to the purchase of buildings, managerial positions, and SRE advertising material, all of which, of course, is tax deductible. So in 2014, the legendary Williams won again when the High Court ruled that the new arrangements also unlawful, and wait for it, that chaplains were of no benefit to students under the law. But of course, that didn't stop our friends Abbott or Morrison, and can't make this stuff up. In 2021, some coalition MPs even wanted to increase funding to help address concerns that climate activism was causing mental health problems for Australian children. So more promising news in 2019, the ACT actually withdrew from the program. Victoria also had success in the same year with a case supported by the Rationalist Society of Australia, and Luke Beck, who's constitutional lawyer expert, is also on the line today, which argues successfully that chaplaincy employment ads were discriminatory. And in June this year, Labor announced they will end the compulsory religious aspect. So although this is a positive, and I do believe it will do little to alter the program, I think there's also issues around promoting youth workers or unqualified secular pastoral care workers at the expense of school counsellors. We really do want the best quality mental health to support our students, not a cheap alternative. So instead, I really think we should be concentrating on just scrapping the program altogether. And as Ron Williams outlined in my interview, qualified school counsellors are exactly what is required. We just need more of them. Now, colleagues, there are a number of really worrying programs that are run in schools, often as part of SRE or other activities of a religious nature. For example, we have hardcore Christians, radical Jesus, or my favourite is the Jesus car racing. In this photo, you can see the amazing influence that Andrew Fishtail Fisher is having on these girls. What an inspiration it'd be for him to come to your school in the Jesus Mobile. Now, as bad as these programs are, I'm actually more concerned about the subtle ones, often disguised as well-being, and the best or the worst examples, depending on how you look at it, are Hillsong and the Shine and the Strength program. Last year, a note came home from my daughter's school, and I've got to say it's an outstanding school. You couldn't have a better one, but they made a mistake here, and it was about an exciting girls program called Shine, and I nearly fell off my chair. This was actually the crap I was researching, and there was not one mention about religion or that the program...
Technical term, is it there?
Yeah, technical term, yes.
Crap?
Yes, or that the program is run or designed by Hillsong. There's no accountability there. And the department, when I contacted them, they have no record of the number of schools that run Shine. But Hillsong boasts it's published in hundreds of Australian schools and worldwide. But the real anti-feminist messaging and narrow gender stereotyping is everywhere, but the most stark in the activities section. And so for girls, the activities include hair care, etiquette, table settings, and tips for the dinner table. Naturally, when I reviewed the Strength program, which is the boys one, the first thing I did was to look for the same activities, and they just weren't there. This says it all, really. Instead, the chapter titles include Too Tough to Get Rough, Man for the Dream, and Leave Your Mark. So what messaging is this sending our girls and our boys? As outlined in my recommendations, it's of course the department's responsibility to regulate the sector, but if left unaddressed, these issues will continue to affect our profession, our campaigns, and our country. Our unfair funding system. In February this year, Federation, we ran a seminar called Why Money Does Matter to mark the 10th anniversary of the Gonski recommendations into school funding. Now, the expert analysis revealed that Australia continues to maintain one of the highest concentration of religious schools compared with other OECD countries. So while the injustice of our unfair funding system is gaining some attention, very little has been paid to the fastest growing sector, the self-styled Christian schools, or I'd probably call them the more fundamentalist schools. For example, as you can see, Australia's exclusive Irreverent school has been described as an extremist cult, which warns children to stay away from the outside world and bans its graduates from physically attending university. Yet the school actually receives more in government funding per student than up to a third of our public schools. City Point College is another example. And look, while I acknowledge not all religious schools have such extremist views, or like City Point, a 2,000-seat auditorium with a large commercial cafe, a bookshop, a skateboarding facility known as the God Bowl. As this research paper has shown, we've got to ask some questions. Who is regulating and evaluating these fundamentalist religious schools, and what effect is this having on Australian society? So some hope. In 2015, the incoming Labor government in Victoria introduced a ministerial direction, actually removing scripture from formal classroom teaching time. Now, this virtually eliminated the program, and significantly most changes occurred under a Conservative government. And department officials I interviewed described the removal of scripture as the most important public service work they'd ever done. Now, in Victoria, activists mobilised parents, the media, and members took school-based action to create what I'd call a perfect storm for change. Now, if it can happen in Victoria, it can happen in other states, and it can happen in New South Wales. And this is also backed up by the legal analysis that I commissioned as part of this report. Reclaiming secularism. The groundswell of public opinion against scripture and government-funded chaplaincy and religious schools, I think needs to become a people power movement. As always, grassroots community organisation is the key to success, as is framing the debate in our own terms. If we can achieve an understanding that secularism protects all faiths and is a framework for ensuring equality, then the question has to be asked, what actually is anti-secular? And there are real shared values and an understanding that inclusion is good for our society and that extremism is not. And I think it's really important for us, as Australia becomes more polarised and divided on political and religious lines, embracing this secularism has never been so important. So some of the key recommendations, and look, removing scripture and reclaiming the secular is not going to be easy. In my opinion, we can no longer afford to be silent, and we need to be really loud and proud of our secular beliefs. So the key recommendations include that as a federation, we should initiate a broad secular awareness campaign targeted both at our members, but also the wider community. This will be launched by a secular conference, which was actually Jane Caro's great idea in one of my interviews, and hosted at Federation House. Now, the aim of the conference would be to raise awareness and build key alliances like tonight, highlight the key campaigns and begin that secular narrative. Opposing the school chaplaincy program, and as part of the Australian Education Union and with other advocacy groups, it's recommended that federations should initiate and support a reinvigorated national campaign. Now, removing SRE and SEE ultimately has to go. The legislation's so prescriptive, but I kind of advocate some short-term changes leading up to that. But at a strategy level, I really believe we need to frame the campaign around time. In the classroom and modern society, time's just crucial. Workloads are excessive and the curriculum is crowded, and scripture's just a massive waste of valuable learning time. Our students need teachers, not preachers. So in conclusion, look, record funding to chaplains and religious schools, this hasn't occurred by accident. There's a small but organised religious lobby that's really influenced our public life, institutions and policy. Fundamentalist religious groups in Australia, they're growing. They have an agenda and they've really taken an interest in public education. And it's time that as a nation shed that taboo topic tag and take an interest in religion in schools too. And colleagues, as this report outlines, the time to reclaim the secular is now, and we need all your support.
Jack, thank you very much. Let's give him a clap for that. We finally got through it. Yeah, thanks everybody. We do have some questions which I'd like to work through that have been sent in beforehand. But Jack, just before we start, You're calling for a grassroots campaign, and that's music to our ears. Your federation has 70,000 members. Can I ask you, how many of those people do you think you might be able to enthuse about getting into this grassroots campaign?
Yeah, look, lots and most. Look, as part of the recommendations, it was for our senior officer and executive to develop a strategy, and some of the ideas I provided in regards to a theme and a slogan, and activating parents and our members and so forth. I think it will really resonate with our members, particularly that focus on time. They're just so overworked at present. So yeah, I definitely think it will resonate with our members, and we definitely do need, I think, parent support. The department and state government is very draconian at the moment. It's a little bit like North Korea at times, and teachers aren't really allowed to speak out often. But yeah, getting that support of the parents is going to be really crucial.
And just before we get into some questions that were sent in during the registration process, I note that you've said that there's a small group of religious zealots or strongly religious people who have had an undue influence and over a long period of time. But I note that Peter Dutton has, well, apparently has said that he thinks that education, or he is taking up education as one of the early battles for the opposition. And we know, of course, that education is the way to reproduce a whole generation of people who tend to agree with the ideas and values that those people who are against what we are for. Sorry, I'm not explaining this very well, but education is the way of regenerating whole cohorts that agree with you one way or the other. So Dutton has already indicated that this is going to be one of the culture war battles that he's going to take on. And I'm sure that it's not only in New South Wales, but in other states that people need this grassroots campaign. So can I finally, before we get into the questions that have been sent in, where are your recommendations arising from your report? Where are they at? Have they been submitted to the Federation? And if so, what's been their response?
Yeah, we're getting there. We're probably at the moment we're running. We've had 3 days industrial action in the last 6 months, and running a massive campaign to increase teacher salaries and working conditions. So it's probably not the primary focus at present, but I know talking to our president and senior officers that it's one of our key focuses. So we'll get there. We'll get there. But you're exactly right. Here we go again with the culture wars. I suppose where they haven't been successful with that is with our curriculum. We've still been able to maintain a very secular curriculum, and our teachers as well. The qualified teachers in the curriculum is our public schools are definitely a secular haven in regards to that regards.
Really good to hear it. Good to hear it. And one last thing before I get to the registration questions. I think I heard you say that your preference and the recommendation in your report is to change the legislation so that you get rid of scripture, but also get rid of special ethics education. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, look, I get it. Ethics is it's important, and I'm a history and philosophy graduate, and there's a lot of research that highlights the importance of, say, philosophy in schools. But we've got exactly the same policy. It's still unqualified teachers. It's still a massive issue in schools in regards to how schools do run. And it's really although it's come about by good intentions, it's really actually helped to legitimise SRE. So we feel that we have general religious education, that ethics should be a part of the curriculum, which it is in many cases as well. But that's where it should be, similar to other countries of how they've incorporated secular religious education with ethics. But yeah, good intentions. But yeah, it's it needs to be a part of the curriculum, not another standalone subject.
Okay, and just again, might I ask, where's Luke? Luke Beck, could you just very briefly explain what we did in Victoria to challenge the chaplaincy program?
Yeah, so in Victoria a number of years ago, there's a woman called Juliet Armstrong who worked as a school chaplain in a number of schools. These are part-time contract positions. I think Jack mentioned the very low pay that chaplains get, so the providers are making money, but the actual people doing the work don't make very much money at all. And so one of her contracts ended, and she was looking for a new post, and all the job ads said, must be Christian. And despite her qualifications as a counsellor and her actual work experience as a school chaplain, she was unable to apply for any of these jobs simply because she wasn't Christian. And so she lodged a complaint in the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal saying this is religious discrimination. And that case settled on confidential terms. But following that case, the Victorian Department of Education changed its chaplain rules, the official program rules, to say that chaplains can be of any faith or of no faith, which theoretically broadens it out. However, in practice, the chaplaincy provider organisations, the Christian labour hire firms in effect, still put out job ads saying must be Christian. And you see that, if you want to, look on seek.com or on any of the other job websites, school chaplains job ads in Victoria, where I am, and in New South Wales, where Jack is, will all say it must be Christian. And so there is an awareness on the part of officialdom, government departments, education departments, that religious discrimination is actually unlawful in almost every part of this country. There are only 2 states where religious discrimination is not unlawful, and it's New South Wales and South Australia. Everywhere else in Australia, religious discrimination is unlawful. So putting out a job ad that says, Muslims, atheists, Hindus not allowed to apply, which is what these job ads say, is unlawful. But you only get a case if it gets to final decision, and if cases settle beforehand, well, then you don't get action. And governments seem not to want to engage with this issue, although we have seen the Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, say he wants to allow schools to choose to have non-religious secular wellbeing workers. But one wonders on what basis a public school could ever choose to say, well, actually, we want to exclude Hindus, Muslims, and atheists from working here. It's a very strange choice for a secular public to make, I would have thought.
Okay, so as some of you might know, RSA has been working on these and other issues to do with the infiltration by religion into not only education, but other areas, parliaments, health systems, and so on, for a long time. And there is some hope because there's been a change from the very conservative government to a much more progressive one. So now is the right time for us to come together and see if we can really build this into a movement. Let's just get round to some of the questions that have been submitted as part of the registration process. And I'll start with one from Ross Corkery, who comes from Tasmania. And Ross asked this: are schools with particular demographics more or less likely to be targeted? For example, low versus high income suburbs. Jack, do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, interesting question. The department actually used to collect this kind of data, but they've stopped collecting it altogether now. And the reason is because numbers are dropped and it would look really, really bad. So it is hard to say. I would imagine, say, Hillsong would perhaps target certain demographics, particularly with that Shine program, often some of our most vulnerable kids. But yeah, hard to say without having that data anymore.
Yeah, well, that's probably deliberate as well, that they don't collect the data. Yeah. And from Lauren Staub in New South Wales, who says, as a parent, how can I address the issue of Christmas and Easter being celebrated at my children's school? For example, if the Easter hat parade is not religious, then why use the term Easter? If it is religious-based, then it shouldn't be part of school activity.
Yeah, another really good question. And part of this research, like, it really highlighted to me how much that has permeated the Judeo-Christianity, that cultural hegemony. And I think Australians really are unaware of that. I would be, I suppose, saying, look, maybe we choose our battles, and it's being such a controversial topic. I think framing the debate is really key. But I'd probably say, look, I think at some point we might get to those kind of questions. I'm not sure if the time is now, but I think to ask the question at the local P&C level and the school level for that one.
Okay, and from Jess Kingsford in New South Wales, she says, I'd be interested to know if there's any data on the difference between various religious faiths in terms of the pressure and influence they're exerting on the education system.
Yeah, another great question. As I said in my report, I think it's really changed, SRE. So I kind of never thought it was harmless, but yeah, it's definitely not harmless now. And I think those really more active fundamentalist groups are getting on board, particularly as Pentecostalism say spreads. And our members, I suppose, are reporting they're hearing more of that horrible talk of that homosexuality is a sin and that women are subservient kind of thing. But being a self-regulating system, any complaints just goes to the providers. But yeah, really another really good question.
And Joan Ross in the ACT calls to mind that in the 1970s there was a group called DOGS, that stands for the Defence of Government Schools. If you are aware of the case that they brought in the courts, do you think that there are lessons to be learned from the DOGS case, and how will the knowledge of all religions be included in the school curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. With the DOGS case, and how different our society might have been if we'd won that case that's similar to America. I think there's some
maybe could you just explain briefly what happened with the DOGS case?
Yeah, so great, I suppose, and that goes to my point I was going to make, how important I think grassroots activism is because the dogs were really arguing that rich schools with pools, and it was unconstitutional for us to fund religious schools with taxpayer money, which is what occurred in America with the win there. But I think it was highlighted in my interviews, and in particular with Luke and also Michael Kirby. Michael felt that there may come a time for us to be able to reopen that case, perhaps not now. And Luke, I know, felt that the decision, how they got to the decision, was wrong, but ultimately they would get to that same decision. But I think as well, we can't rely on legislation, and America is a good example of that. Even though they had that win and it is unconstitutional, they've been able to get around that because of how devolved that system is. So it's obviously important for us to keep fighting legally, but I think it's going to be won and lost on the ground as grassroots activism. The second part of that question, I think general religious education is the key to having all religions taught. That could possibly be expanded in schools, but it's currently there. But other countries, and countries like Quebec and even England, they actually have, let's say, a general religious education or worldview or secular view course, and that actually promotes tolerance. We don't want our kids to not learn about religion at all, but learning about all religions is very different to being indoctrinated into one.
Yeah, and a general religious education can include not just education about religions, but also education about belief systems, and which might include secularism, or at least political secularism.
Absolutely, yeah. Mm.
Here's one from Jeffrey Green in New South Wales, and he asks, is part of the reason that Teachers Federation are not, the teachers are not more vocal in their objection to SRE in schools is due to their getting a well-needed break from face-to-face teaching when SRE is delivered by an outsider?
Well, we definitely need a well-needed break. And as I talked about that industrial action we've taken, primary school colleagues haven't had release time additional since the 80s, and our high school not since the 50s. But I actually think freeing up that time would actually free up a significant amount of release for teachers during that time. I actually think the reason why they may not seem to be so vocal is because it is a self-regulating system, and so any complaints just get managed by the provider, not the department. But the other reason, as I mentioned, that unfortunately teachers are really being stifled at the moment, and often fear actually to coming out and saying what they think.
So what if a teacher in New South Wales did maybe say something on social media, or maybe they're interviewed by a journalist and they're critical of SRE, what typically might happen to them?
They could probably be okay being critical of SR. Yeah, and I'd have to get, I wouldn't want to set them up for failure kind of thing. Basically, we make sure we get our federation representatives to speak on members' behalf, and then they're totally covered in that regard.
But still, the fact that they might be fearful or anxious about saying something critical of SRE is a comment in itself.
Yes, yep.
Yeah. Here's one from Conrad Liveris in Western Australia, who asks, what role do P&Cs have in achieving the outcome that we're wanting? Many school chaplains also undertake pastoral care responsibilities. Should this be a dedicated role? I presume that pastoral care responsibilities is what he's suggesting.
Yeah, another interesting question. I'm just mindful, Meredith, I've got 3% left on my battery, so the Zoom must really run it down. So if I cut out, I cut out. But
almost through to the end of the questions.
Yeah, I think we got to be really careful. And again, it's probably good intentions, but it might be different in other states. But we don't want to water down any qualifications. School counsellors play a really important role. So a little bit like we've got a massive teacher shortage in New South Wales, but and across Australia, there's often talk about, you can get a 6 months trained teacher, or watering down the standards. We actually need high standards and professionals. So I really think we just need to focus on scrapping the program, the chaplaincy program, and getting school counsellors and more of them.
Okay, and final question from Colin McKay in Victoria, with regard to Christian nationalism and the Seven Mountains Mandate. Jack, do you know what the Seven Mountains Mandate means?
Yeah.
Okay. Having just bearing that in mind, how effective do you think Christianity has been in infiltrating our education system?
Yeah, look, I actually wrote a chapter a little bit on this, the Seven Mandate and the Dominion. It didn't make the editors. It didn't make the editors chop, unfortunately, and it was probably out of the scope of this of my report. Anyway, but if you'd asked me maybe with Scott Morrison as Prime Minister and he talks about laying on hands and things like that, I might have said, look, we're losing the battle a little bit. But I think the big point I'd like to make is that I don't think many Australians are actually aware that there's a battle going on for the hearts and of our kids in our schools. But there is a group, and they're organised, and they're small minority, but they're quite powerful, and they're having a battle. And we can't win a battle if 90% of the population aren't actually aware of it. But it is really alarming that there's books published to infiltrate 7 areas of our society. And I'll probably finish by quoting Marion Maddox, who said, if you wanted to change a country, the best way is, where you'd start is through education. And I suppose that the good news is our teachers are highly qualified, our curriculum is highly regulated and secular, but there's massive concerns about SRE, chaplaincy, and I suppose normalising that church presence in schools. It's just really alarming.
Jack, I'm going to let you go just in case you completely run out of battery. We've got a few minutes left because we started a bit late, and with everybody's indulgence, I'm just going to ask 2 people who are on the chat to unmute and say a few words. And those 2 are Alison Quarters from Queensland, and also Darren Morgan from New South Wales. And Darren, I wonder if we might start with you, because I know you've been fighting the good fight for many years through FIRIS, Fairness in Religions in Schools. And could you just take a couple of minutes to update everybody about what you've been doing and where you're at now?
Can I also ask, can Craig McPherson join this conversation just very quickly? Because sure. Craig and I have worked very closely together, and Craig is carrying the torch forward. I've spent 10 years. I started as a primary ethics teacher, an instructor, thinking that was the right answer, or that at least was a response. But once I got to understand the policies and the procedures, and I started to look at schools and realize that they weren't being followed, I ended up joining FIRIS, or taking FIRIS into New South Wales, because it started in Victoria, and then very quickly realised I could no longer work for primary ethics, and I now perceive primary ethics as part of the problem. Craig can probably talk about where we're currently at. What we have done, though, my biggest emphasis was on, whatever we say about the providers, there's nothing we can do to make them change, because it's completely self-regulated. The department has no power. So the minister has no control over their curriculum. The minister has no control over who they choose to deliver SRE. My emphasis for the last few years has been demonstrating that the department continues to allow this monster in our schools without controlling it, and has no interest in controlling it. So it was about demonstrating that their policies and procedures weren't being followed, and and compliance wasn't being monitored. So that was my emphasis. Unfortunately, that's just been shut down by hardcore bureaucratic stonewalling, and in my opinion, just lies in response to questions in Parliament and so on. So I am handing over to Craig now to talk about his vision for carrying the campaign forward, if that's okay, on FIRIS in New South Wales.
Craig?
If he's willing.
Here we go.
Hi.
Hi. Go ahead.
Like Darren, have spent a large number of years. I've probably been a member of FIRIS for 7 or 8 years, active for 7 or so, with a short break for a year or so. I think we've achieved a reasonable amount in small ways. And I see the can being carried forward largely by organisations such as the Teachers Federation, the peak principals bodies in New South Wales, the Secondary Principals Council, and the Primary Principals Association, probably in conjunction with the New South Wales Parents and Citizens Federation. I think that the only major achievements can be obtained through entities like that and through a wider public presence. I mean, FIRIS has stayed reasonably small for a number of reasons. As we got active in New South Wales, we were concerned that we would be infiltrated by members of religious organisations or monitored by them by having a wider membership or other things like that. So we have stayed as a reasonably small group, and we've continued to chip away, but I don't think that we can achieve much more than we have been able to achieve. I think the census results will change things. I think that things will continue to change over the next 4 or 5 years, particularly with the federal government we now have, or the federal parliament we now have, which is a much more balanced parliament. I don't think anything can be any major changes in New South Wales politically can be achieved by a change of government. The New South Wales state election, the next election is in March 2023, and I do not believe that an incoming Labor state government will change the provision for
Certainly,
scripture.
the census suggested that New South Wales is the most religious of all Australian states.
New South Wales would probably be the most religious place in the former British Commonwealth. Potentially is the place with the most political influence by religious organisations and individuals within those organisations. It's quite outstanding, particularly through the Anglican and the Catholic Church, and I guess to a certain extent the Pentecostal churches, although that's probably only through Scott Morrison in New South Wales, and maybe Alex Hawke if the rumours about him are true. But yeah, it's surprising how much influence they have, and particularly the Anglican Church in Sydney, which of course is one of the most conservative religious organisations in the world.
Thanks.
Can I just say this before to really quickly just to cap off what Craig just said. The other thing on top of getting the peak bodies on board, another huge success of FIRIS, not that many people would know this, is that we've kind of got the government to acknowledge that SRE should be opt-in and that children shouldn't be in there without express consent from parents. It's not being followed, but we've finally got that change, that it's buried in policy, that there's a statement that children shouldn't be placed in SRE without this parent letter being returned. So it's a small win, but it's a very important one. And I think the SRE lobby are fighting to get that change back to enable schools to put kids in SRE without consent. So that's where we'll be keeping an eye on the department's policies.
Happened in Victoria as well, sort of chipping away on the bureaucracy and the procedures and regulations rather than going directly for a change in the legislation. Finally, Alison, could I ask you to just update us about QPSS and what you're doing up in Queensland?
I certainly can. And can you unmute Julia so she can join in?
Julia can unmute herself.
I'm unmuted.
You're unmuted. There she is.
I am now, but you're our spokesperson for a reason, so take it away.
So we started QPSS it was about 8 years ago, and we've had a big impact in terms of getting better informed consent from parents, and participation has gone down as a result. We're stakeholders with the department, and unlike FIRIS, they actually appear to communicate quite nicely with us and ask us to let them know of any problems. So at least we're we're not black band like FIRIS is with the New South Wales Department of Education. There's actually quite a bit happening in Queensland. I don't want to go into details, but it appears there might be some appetite within the current Labor ALP government to address RI. The biggest issue is that time is needed back for the curriculum, and with everything else that's been happening, with COVID and so forth, that wasted time just, is flashing lights as should not be here.
Okay, so that's the same sort of thing that Jack focused on or suggested that we should focus on.
Yes, and exactly, and that's what we're focusing on in our discussions with members of the government. Is that, look, all you need to say is that we need to get that time back.
Okay.
For teaching. So we actually are about to start a campaign where we want supporters to actually talk to their local MPs, particularly, well, mainly the Labor ones, because they're the only ones that can change, can change the law. Greens are already on side, and so we need the ALP. I had a question for Jack, but I think he might have gone.
I think he's run out of battery.
Yeah, my question was, so the Queensland Teachers Union has had a long-standing official policy opposing religious instruction, and as well as chaplaincy. It's sitting on their policy, but they don't seem to to push it too much. I'm wondering if the New South Wales Teachers Federation talked to Queensland Teachers Union about it. We've sent Jack's report into one of our contacts who is on the executive, but we don't know if they've done that direct liaison, because everything in that report is the same applies to Queensland. And in fact, Jack has done a section on Queensland and the work that we've done. So I'd like to see the two unions work together. And
well, that sounds like a very sensible idea. I'm conscious that some people are now dropping out, and that's because we're going later into the evening. So I'm going to wrap this up, but with your indulgence, just one last thing. Rosemary Lynch from Western Australia, I wonder, can you just unmute yourself for a sec and give us just a minute or so about what's happening in Perth and in Western Australia?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Meredith. Yeah, there seems to be quite a lot going on in our state at the moment. We've got a few things that are of interest. We've got the Karen Garn-Jones, who is a retired principal, has put a complaint into the Equal Opportunity Commission because she's unable to work as a chaplain and she would like to. So that's quite an interesting development, and that is going through the processes at the moment. We also have one of our local schools, Maylands Peninsula Primary, where the PNC, they managed to get, they ran a survey among the parent population where they were asking parents if they were in favour of inclusive hiring practices for chaplains. And of the 80 or so responses that they had to the survey, I think there were only 9 who were not in favour of an inclusive hiring practice, so an equal opportunity hiring situation. So that's really, that survey was fantastic, because what we would all see in a lot of schools is that the school newsletter, they give an opportunity for the school chaplain to have a little chat, but you never really have that opportunity for the school community to actually have that say in the hiring practice. So that has, with the help of the Rationalist Society, we've been able to get some media articles, and that's been really useful, I think, in opening up this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Rosemary. I'm going to start calling this to a close because it's getting late in the evening, and again, I apologise for the technicalities, the problems with the technology earlier on. Thank you for your patience. I would just close off by not only thanking Jack and the other contributors, but also to say at the Rationalist Society, we try to keep a track of these activities that are going on in various states. And our campaigns and communications coordinator, Cy Gladman, tends to write these up into articles, which we then post on our website. So if you if you're interested in finding out what's going on in other states, have a look at our website. There's a great repository of just descriptions about various projects and initiatives that are being taken in various states. And if you know of additional activities that are going on that we don't know about, we'd be very happy to help publicise those or to support local initiatives where we know about them. So please feel free to get in touch. We can, if we could act as a bit of a clearinghouse and a gathering together of information about these various projects and actions across Australia. Having said all that, I can see that this was a very popular topic, and again, on your behalf, I'd really like to thank Jack for a wonderful presentation. Again, encourage you to download the link to his report. It's a terrific read. I would suggest we should share that report far and wide and then start acting upon it. When I close off this meeting, you'll find that there's a little 3-item survey that I'm going to ask you to fill out. If you do have any ideas about what further actions we could take as a result of the sort of recommendations that Jack has made, please record them in that little survey, which you'll find pops up on your screen when I close this meeting. So having said that, thanks again, everybody, for your time. Apologies for the rocky start, and thank you for your patience bearing with us until this late hour of the evening. I hope to see you again in 4 weeks' time. Watch out on our website for the next topic. Thanks, everybody, and good night.